As we turn to the Holy Scriptures, may the wisdom they contain be made clear to us so that we may navigate our way with faith, hope, and love. Amen. Our reading today comes from the book of Genesis, all the way back in the beginning here, starting with chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. I imagine this is a familiar story to most, but I'm going to bet that some of the conversation today will trudge into unfamiliar territory, as it so often does. So, Genesis 22, 1 through 14. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." What a story. Whenever I read this, and it's surprising maybe how often this comes up in a lot of different contexts, I think it's interesting all the stuff that they leave out, right? So there's so many gaps. Okay, Abraham and Isaac are walking to the place. How does Abraham feel? How is he behaving? When Isaac asks, where's the lamb? We don't have anything for sacrifice. And, "Oh, God will provide." Is he crying as he says that? Is he snapping at Isaac because he's so upset with what he has to do? It says he binds Isaac to put him on the wood. Does Isaac just let him? Does Isaac fight back? I mean, Abraham's pretty old. Part of me has to think Isaac could have gotten away. I don't know. There's just so much not in the story. There's so many different versions of this story, of what's going on, of their demeanor and their tone, and all the little bits in between the story we have that aren't there. We just don't know how to frame. And the story overall seems really odd, right? We don't often talk about God needing to to test people in this way because we're so comfortable with the idea of God just knowing our thoughts and feelings and commitment to things and what we're willing to do. And yet here, man, either God's going way out of God's way just to have a good story for the book, or legitimately God is unsure what's going to happen, and that is a sermon for another day. But what I want to get into today, largely, is that while this story seems terrifyingly strange to us, I have children, and the thought of trying to kill one of them to appease that, I don't know that I would be particularly excited about serving a God that wants me to murder my children. But child sacrifice in the ancient world was a pretty common experience. And it would probably not have seemed that strange to Abraham or to a lot of the early readers of this, because it is an extremely widespread practice around both the Western Semitic region, so kind of along the end of the Mediterranean, and later spreads to all of North Africa and a lot of colonies in Greece and the southern end of Italy as the Phoenicians spread out. The practice is called mulk. It's M-U-L-K is how it's usually written in Semitic languages. And the traditional version of the mulk offering involves usually a fire with some kind of statue or idol or ornament over it, and you place the child between the hands of the altar or something that's outreached, and then let it drop into the flames to be consumed. This is sometimes referred to as passing through the flames. And this shows up repeatedly in here. This isn't just an Abraham and Isaac thing. First off, anytime you see Moloch or Molech, which appears half a dozen times throughout here, that is not a deity, that is just their rendering of mulk. That is their version of the Phoenician Semitic mulk. It is that type of sacrifice. So if I'm just going down the list of verses that talk about child sacrifice, in no particular order, we have Leviticus 18:21 and Leviticus 20:2-7, 1 Kings 11:7, 2 Kings 23:10, Isaiah 57:9, Jeremiah 32:35, Deuteronomy 12:31, Jeremiah 7:31, and 19:4-6, Judges 11:30-40, 2 Kings 16:3. This isn't a one-off story in here. This was a common practice in the ancient world in these regions. And it was not an unheard of practice in ancient Israel, which if you are interested in following along, I promise I'm not making this up. If you go to Ezekiel 20:25, which is page 687 if you want to read it along with me, but you don't have to. I want to read this. We've talked about Ezekiel a little bit before. Ezekiel was a priest in the temple in Jerusalem before it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and he was taken into exile in Babylon, right? So he was a priest in the temple, became a prophet, wrote this whole long book. At about the same time he's writing, actually shortly after he's writing, the first 5 books, your Genesis, Exodus, all that finishes being edited together. So it's very likely that his writings predate those Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus books as we have them at least, because they were still being edited together. And in 25-26, he is talking about how, from speaking on behalf of God, God is saying, people didn't listen to me, I said bad things would happen, I gave them these rules and they didn't follow them. And then in 25 he says, moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not live. I defiled them through their very gifts, in their offering up all their firstborn, in order that I might horrify them, so that they might know that I am the Lord. A priest from the temple in Jerusalem specifically indicates that this was a practice in Israel and Judah. And more terrifyingly, that it was given by God as a bad ordinance. What it says. So, I now want to draw our attention back a little bit to Exodus. There's a bunch of rules in Exodus. And remember, Exodus is being compiled while they're in Babylon into its current form. It's lots of different pieces that were smushed together. Getting lots of Bible today, but it's important, or I'm going to sound crazy. We go to Exodus 34. It may not stop me from sounding crazy, but it helps. In Exodus 34:20, we get these rules. Actually, 19. All that first opens the womb is mine. All your male livestock, the firstborn of cow and sheep, the firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem. So after this, after Ezekiel admits to this practice, we then get a line that says, all the firstborns are mine. What do you do with stuff that's God's? You burn it or you kill it to send it to God. It's why you break the necks of things that you aren't going to redeem. And then they add in this tagline, which appears exactly 2 times in this exact same formula, all the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem. So coming out of Babylon, now they have a way to make an offering that doesn't involve sacrificing your children. But before that, it may not have been exceedingly common, but it was common enough that Ezekiel records it as an ordinance that was practiced. So the default assumption, even in here, even with the modified rules, the default assumption is that the firstborn of animals and of humans belongs to God and is to be sent to God. They then give you an out. You can pay the redemption price or a lamb. The oldest text in the Bible, the book of Judges, seems totally comfortable with the idea of human sacrifice. I'm jumping to Judges chapter 11. This is a guy named Jephthah. He is fighting the Ammonites, and he says, God, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out the door of my house to meet me when I return victorious shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. He inflicted a massive defeat, blah, 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 blah. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing. She was his only child. He had no son or daughter except her. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me low. You have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. And she gets a couple months to party and then is burned. The near sacrifice to Isaac is not a one-off story in here. It's rare in that it isn't completed. All right. Downer for the morning. So, how do we get from that to an understanding well before even Jesus' time that sacrificing your children is not an acceptable practice? Because it says that. Most of these things that I quoted in here, most of these verses, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Deuteronomy and Exodus that I just read either give an alternative, right? You can pay this price, or they just condemn it as a practice. But most of those texts appear after the Babylonian exile. So at some point, they took their practices, their ideas, their decrees from God, as Ezekiel says, and they realized, or they were told, that it is time for that to change. That is Ezekiel's position on it, at least. This has been our practice. It is not to be our practice anymore. It was an ordinance given by God as a punishment and should no longer be inflicted. That is a terrifying thought. Not just the sacrifice part, but now we have to now think of what that means for how we interpret all of this, right? That there are all kinds of bad examples in here. And we are really good at going back to the past and trying to seek wisdom from this. And we should. I love this. I talked about that last week. I love this book. There's all kinds of great stories. There's all kinds of great wisdom. There's all kinds of great examples. This is a conversation about God, a God of love. And yet, there are all of these things that have to be re-understood. Jesus re-understands a lot of things. Jesus renegotiates a lot of texts. We've talked about a whole lot of those over the months that I have been here. So how many other things might this refer to? How many things in here? There are things in here that we don't pay any attention to, right? How many of you are wearing clothing that is made of two different kinds of fabric? Polyester cotton blends or something, right? Yeah. You're supposed to be exiled or killed for that. Nobody cares anymore. We have decided that is totally irrelevant. Why? Because when we went through and renegotiated the text, when we went through and re-understood what it meant in light of our understandings through Jesus, in light of our understandings through the Spirit, we decided that wasn't that important to God after all. So, our responsibility then, as followers of God, as people who study these texts, as people who seek to be disciples of Christ, is not to be unreflexive in our reading and understanding and practice, but to continue to review. That's why the Spirit is always portrayed as this living, moving, breathing thing, another advocate. We are never meant to be a static entity that sets out a rule 3,200 years ago and then never changes. Was never the point. It was never how it worked. In here, it isn't how it worked. There's two lists of the 10 Commandments. One shows up like 100 years before the other, and they're not the same. They updated. Important stuff. Because our lives together, our lives in God, is a constant, dynamic thing. We are always being led forward into new ways of growing, new visions of faith, new possibilities. God, a thing is dead inasmuch as it cannot surprise you, and it is alive inasmuch as it still can. And if we are to be people of a living God, a resurrected living Christ, a living Spirit in us, then we still need to be able to surprise the world and each other and ourselves. Because that's what they do. That's what the examples show. That's what the prophets speak about. That's what happens in the rules as you follow them along. We forge together a new way to live and breathe and grow in faith and in hope and in love. We move forward into a divine imagination for the future. That's what we talked about in the beginning of December, right? That's what that time period is about this new future that God is bringing. That future is not just our own past. It is something new that God has imagined for us, a better place and a better world. And we cannot be trapped out of God's better future by being stuck in a human past. Amen.